You'll notice I've changed my title. I thought about it, and I thought that hunting was a little too active for what was going on. And really what we're doing is herding a whole lot of dinosaurs out of past systems. From the title, you'll gather that I'm fairly critical of what I'm looking at, and I think I need a kind of declaration or mea culpa every time I speak. And the reason is that I'm a publisher. I'm not wearing a bulletproof vest, but I am a publisher. However, I'm a publisher who believes in open access and access to research in particular. And I'm a publisher who believes that, particularly in Africa, the commercial model simply doesn't work. It's a nonsense. It never has worked. It never will work. And we have been deluding ourselves for a long time that scholarly publishing is a commercial business. Also, I think as a publisher, you must realize that we ask ourselves fairly dispassionate questions. You look at a communications environment, and what you say is, given what you want to communicate, who's the audience? What do they need? What medium? What layout? What design? What language level? What level of illustration? Whatever. So you focus your mind on a market, but a market in a fairly neutral, non-commercial sense. And when the Open Society Institute, to whom I owe immense thanks, gave me a fellowship for the last year to look at research publication policy in South Africa and other African countries, that was the question I had in the back of my mind always. If this is the policy, what should you be looking at as the output for that policy? And I've come up with some fairly startling and wonderful answers, and I've had great fun. It's been a wonderful year. An entire year for making trouble was absolutely made for me. So, where we start from, a lot of the discussion about access to knowledge, and I think Jimmy Wales touched on this very effectively a little earlier, is access to whose knowledge? This question was asked at a conference in Leiden, which was convened by Kodazria, and the answer was, whose knowledge? And it must be African knowledge, by and for Africans, for African purposes. Very often in the development discourse, what we're told is, as Jimmy said, here we've got some wonderful, wealthy knowledge in the north, have it, you have it. I'm very suspicious of that because I think there can be hidden agendas in that, which I'll come back to. But my major interest is how we grow African knowledge. And here we've got a quote by our president, and our president, bless him, can be very literary sometimes. Not everybody has a president who likes quoting Shakespeare from time to time, or even misquoting it. But here he said something very eloquent about what I'm talking about. He said, for our continent to take its rightful place in the history of humanity, we need to undertake with a degree of urgency a process of reclamation and assertion. We must contest the colonial denial of our history and must initiate our own conversations and dialogues about our past. And this obviously applies to our present and future as well. We need our own historians and our own scholars to interpret the history of our continent. He was talking there in the context of the Timbuktu Library Project, but it applies broadly. And yet this is not what you're going to find when we look at research policy and research publication policy. And I think what we need to state up front is the obvious thing. South Africa is not in America. And the believe it or not is rather a cynical believe it or not. Because I found that a lot of the policy of the Department of Education for research publication actually behaves as if we are in America and behaves as if our knowledge belongs in America. Whereas I feel we should not be exporting our knowledge and importing other people's. We should be growing what we have. And there's a very good reason for that. And that is that African knowledge is very, very marginalized in the global arena. We produce 3% of the books and we consume 12%. And bear in mind that we consume far too little, so that figure is even more extreme than it looks. If you look at online content, and this I think is around about 2002, Africa produced 0.2 of online content. And if you take out South Africa, 0.02% of content on the web was from Africa. Probably has grown a little now, but still we are practically silent. We used to be the bookless continent. We still remain the silent continent. If you look at my field, scholarly publishing, South Africa actually makes it into the top percentile of people with citations in the ISI indexes, but way down the bottom somewhere. And if you look at the spread of journals, 80% of the articles in the ISI indexes come from the major northern scholarly journals, from the US, from the UK, and from Europe. 163 developing countries produce just 2.5%. That's why I had that rather sarky, we are not America. We buy into the system and we sell ourselves to it. We're still selling ourselves into slavery in these systems. How can a journal system with an accreditation profile like that be a place to publish African knowledge? It certainly is very skewed. The question about that very low percentage of African knowledge is not, as some would claim, that we haven't got any knowledge there. I was quite horrified to find when the British Commission on Copyright and Development met about 3 years ago, the section on copyright actually said out loud, we don't have to worry about Africa, they don't produce anything anyhow. And so they advocated very generous exceptions so that in South Africa things could be photocopied without permission very broadly. And that basically would mean we would be even more dependent on content from the north, because if you photocopy very broadly in a marginal market, you're going to wipe it out. It's that kind of thinking I think we have to be chary of. In spite of the marginalization of African knowledge, one of the weird things about this terrain, and when I looked at it more closely it became even weirder, is that there are not policies about supporting publication. They are only policies on academics writing articles. Nowhere does the policy ask itself how South African knowledge is going to get out there and who's going to pay for it. It's simply not there. And this is what Joseph Esposito, in a recent article in Logos, the publishing journal, calls the free rider syndrome. He said, across the world, institutions don't think that publishing is their job. Somebody else will do it. Elsevier will do it. Springer will do it. Wiley will do it. A university press will do it, and the university does not have to take responsibility. Now, when you think that the major mission of a university is communication of knowledge, I find that quite extraordinary. Yet it's common across the world. A recent Australian report commented that in spite of vast sums of money being spent on research, research dissemination is not on the research agenda. Dissemination just happens. So it is indeed a very strange field that I occupy. Another challenge which is particular to South Africa, and this comes from Martin Hall at UCT speaking at a development bank conference. The government is asking for performance from the universities, and it's asking that the universities demonstrate the value for money that the government is putting in terms of research. Research policy is very development focused. What are the universities contributing? Now, if you step back to the last slide and you say, well, the universities actually aren't very concerned at all about the dissemination of their research in terms of published dissemination, you're going to have the government asking questions about exactly what you're doing. What publication does is provide a record and an accessible record of what research is being done and enables it to have impact. So Martin says the universities need to assert the importance of their independence and the value of their knowledge commons as a seedbed of innovation, ranging from product development to the design of effective public policies. They need to show how their work is responsive to the pressing needs of development. And that, I believe, is something that South African universities are not doing at the moment. And the reasons have to do largely with policy and to a certain extent with practice. If you go back a step to print publications, and I have spent time in university presses in South Africa, the marginalization of knowledge out of the developing world, and particularly out of Africa, is a very physical business. There are physical barriers like tariff barriers and the difficulty of shipping books and the difficulty of getting payment within Africa, so that very often cross-Africa trade becomes very difficult and people just give up on it. When it comes to trading with what the publishers see as the powerful markets of the North, particularly the big markets of America, they simply hit a brick wall. And it's an ideological wall as much as a market wall. If you try and sell a South African book or a South African journal to an American library, I think you can imagine what the response is. A shrug, and why? Mostly complete indifference. The scholars who are interested in African stuff are not interested enough, and there are not enough of them, to push the weight in that library market, particularly with the pressure libraries are under, to subscribe to the ever-increasing costs of the major commercial journals. If you try and buy this kind of book through Amazon, you're likely to get a polite note saying, availability difficult. Try, for example, to get David Goldblatt's latest book of photographs on the Afrikaners, a wonderful book, and you just get a little blue picture, no image available, availability difficult. Now, that's published by Random House. You imagine what happens to books published by scholarly publishers. In the print world, there's a very real reason for stuff not to be disseminated. The market is not made for it, it's too difficult, and there is considerable resistance to it. The resistance is in the gatekeepers. I think it's important to note, not necessarily in the consumers. It's the distributors, the libraries, the booksellers who block access to African knowledge, so there might well be many more readers out there who want it. I said a little earlier that it's not a matter of African knowledge not being out there, but simply of it not being disseminated or broadcast effectively. There are many situations in which our knowledge is better and more desirable. And there is a body count in a failure to disseminate knowledge. And the slide I've put up here obviously has to do with the tsunami, which is perhaps the most dramatic image of what happens when you do not have effective research dissemination in a developing world situation. The truth was they simply did not have the dissemination of weather data and earthquake data in the Pacific as they do in the Atlantic around the American coast. And a lot of people died and a lot of notice was taken. But I think you'll notice from this picture, one of the reasons so much notice was taken, that a lot of the people who died were tourists. And so there was a northern engagement with what happened in the tsunami. You take it further, this is a world in which, in scholarly research publication, more is published on Alzheimer's in dogs than on sleeping sickness. And I kid you not. Certainly more is published on treating acne than is published on sleeping sickness or malaria. In other words, the research agendas are skewed by what's going on in this environment in which knowledge from the north is what counts and what weighs. But there is a body uncount as well. Now, the body uncount is a wonderful idea. It came from Neil Stephenson, the science fiction writer. And he developed a measure of success which was how many people didn't die because of what you did, which I think would be a much better research measure for what we do than much of what isn't currently in place. And what I'm showing you here reflects a project in India. Subia Arunachalam spoke about it, and it was carried out by the MS Surinathan Research Institute in Chennai. And what they did was they looked at the fishermen along the Indian coast, and they said that too many people were dying because they were being caught in storms. So they collected data from the weather sites on the internet. They then translate this data into written materials and audio materials. These then get beamed to the villages by internet. The audio is broadcast over radio and over loudspeakers in the village, and the weather data is put up on notice boards in the villages. And Arun says, since they did this, not one single fisherman has died in any of the fishing villages that they are covering. And he said rather apologetically, they only reached 48,000 villages so far. They haven't done them all yet. Now, this, I think, is a very good example of how research communication extends way beyond simply publishing articles in journals, but has to encompass the whole range of communications that come out of scholarship. Scholar to community, farmer to scholar, and indeed student to scholar. These two-way communications become much more possible in a web environment. And the model is increasingly becoming digital content storage and then transmission for output in a multiplicity of chosen media. Context in which this takes place is not just the context of digital delivery, which allows you to reach more widely. Clearly, if you look at that image of the brick wall that encountered print books, this is not so in the digital arena. Digitally, the broadcast of scholarly knowledge has no boundaries, and the actual transmission has no cost. And this transforms the environment utterly. But it's not only that, and I think we have to grapple with the fact that it runs much deeper than that. And this is from Yochai Benkler, Essential Reading, which he says the changes are deep, and they affect economic organization and social practices in the production. And there are new opportunities, he says, for how we make and exchange information, knowledge, and culture. What we have to note, particularly in Africa, is that these changes that the internet has brought increase the role of non-market and non-proprietary production by individuals and cooperative efforts in a wide range of loosely or... To my mind, that is what we're good at in Africa. Loosely or tightly woven collaborations is what we do. You know, take a woman in Mpumalanga who decides that preschool education is necessary. Before you know where you are, you'll have an elaborate range of networks right across the province that it would take dozens of academics to untangle or understand because they're informal and they're loosely structured. And that kind of collaboration we do. I had some fun, and this is a bit left of field. At the iCommons conference in Rio last year, quite a row broke out about the fact that the iCommons is a networked society. And there was some fairly work. And I flew home on that long flight thinking very hard and remembered that at Wits Press in the 90s, I published a young man from Princeton called Clifton Kress. And Clifton talked about how in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, in the early stages of the colonial period, there was a two-way interaction. It wasn't simply the colonials impacting on the local community, but both ways. So I went and looked through Clifton, and I found this. And listen to it. This is part of my argument about the developing world being in a position where it is both ahead and behind the rest of the world. And sometimes it's ahead because it's behind. This is how Clifton describes the Eastern Cape communities at the turn of the 19th century that were encountered by the early colonists. And the early colonists were baffled. They could not understand a community that was not hierarchical, patriarchal, paternalistic, and bounded by territory. So he said political power tended to be localized, boundaries fluid and vague, and the authority of chiefs highly variable. The political landscape was both homogeneous and kaleidoscopic, with widely dispersed material and symbolic resources and constantly changing political domains. Even at moments of relative status, domains of authority very frequently overlapped. Political identities were multiple, with the fluidity of identities generally increasing with geographical distance from any given center of power. There were multiple nodes and overlapping domains of authority. I think we are the networked world. We were the networked world. And perhaps we need to recover that kind of informal, collaborative communication that lies within our societies. And for Larry's sake, I will repeat that in this passage continues. There was a debate in the iCommons about leadership, and they said, how can you have a networked society with a leader? And the debate continued. It said there were men who wore leopard skins and lion skins and appeared to have more authority than others and had more wives and more cattle. And Heather laughed out loud because the poster for Creative Commons South Africa was Larry in a leopard skin. But, said Clifton Kress, this authority was not bounded, it was fluid and movable. It wasn't constant and continuous and wasn't over everything. I've introduced this because I enjoy it, but also I think it does reveal things at a deeper level about where we come from and the kind of things we deny in our policy and our practice in research dissemination. If we step to policy itself, which is what I had to study in the fellowship, it's important to acknowledge that particularly in the fast-changing environment we're in, policy has to look forward. If you're formulating policy, it has to be policy for 2016, not policy for 10 years ago. And I think on that front, some of our policies have failed rather badly. Start with research and innovation policy. This is the domain of the Department of Science and Technology. There are two sides to it, and they do conflict a bit. The first, which I've represented by the AIDS ribbon, is highly developmental in its focus. And this is a persistent thread in science and innovation policy in South Africa and across Africa. Research must be for development. Research must promote health, education, employment, economic upliftment, national advancement, increased democracy. Those are the constant threads in that side of the argument. That kind of research policy emphasizes collaboration, interdisciplinary study, and the use of ICTs and new technologies. The other half, and I'll come back to tech ICTs in a moment, the other half represented there by the SART telescope is highly technologically. I think this epitomizes as much as anything that we are a second economy country. We sit between the developing and the developed world, and this has very distinct advantages in it. Highly technical, innovation is the word. It's technicist in its approach, and the kind of research policy represented by that telescope is one that advocates the creation of patents and copyrights. In other words, when you're developing highly technical stuff, according to the DST policy, what you should be doing is producing patents. And if you look overall at the DST research and innovation policy, those are the only measures that you'll find. The measure of success in policy, according to the documents, which clashes rather with the idea of development, is that you count the number of journal articles and you count the number of patents, and that's what shows you have researched effectively. If I step back a little to the question of ICTs, I puzzled a long time over why there was a gap in the policy on ICTs, and eventually fathomed that it was this. The talk of ICTs talks of ICTs as a transmission device. It talks of networks and webs. It talks of connectivity and broadband. What is missing is the content. What is communicated? In other words, it's as if you're making a pipeline, but you haven't got a reservoir for the water to come through the pipeline. You haven't got water in your pipeline. And somebody I was reading very recently says that when you talk of access, when access is the chief driver of your discourse, then you tend to talk about networks and not about content. And that is a very distinct flaw in the DST's policy, is this idea that ICTs means a network, you build a system, but you don't stop to think till long afterwards what you put into that system. And far from seeing research as irrelevant or arcane, I see research in a country like this as the reservoir that fills the pipeline, and that then leads to the information that goes to other scholars, to students, to the community, to the government, to policymakers. Now, I've quoted Bentley here. I'm not going to go through this whole quote, but I think it's very important to note this thread of argument in the North. Bentley argues very strongly that patents for developing countries are stupid. Not only stupid, but I think immoral. And he sees patents as being a way of making developing countries pay above marginal prices for stuff that was not developed for them, but was developed for northern markets. He says the information, knowledge, and information-embedded goods paid for would have been developed in expectations of rich world rents alone. The prospect of rents from poorer countries do not affect their development. And I think here and in other places when it comes to publication, we tend to lapse into a very thoughtless discourse. This stuff is not examined. Academics don't rack their brains about it and tear it apart the way they do other things. In the Copy South report, it was described as, and I forget who they're quoting, a 1950s writer, calls it transcendental nonsense. There's certain areas that you simply don't examine. You don't think about them. You take them utterly for granted. Like publishing in journal articles, peer review, all that stuff. People don't debate it. Patents are the same. Patents are simply regarded as something you do, and if you get a patent, you must be doing something good and you must be making money. But I'm afraid that is patently nonsense. The American universities don't make money out of patents. So how do we expect that we will? I was horrified to discover in a meeting at the university the other day, and I've only been back at university a short while, that our universities are spending up to 750,000 rand registering world patents, and yet they will not spend 20,000 rand on a publication. Why? What is going on here? Bentley's last sentence, I think, is telling. He said, the morality of this redistribution from the world's poor to the world's rich has never been confronted or defended in the European or American public spheres. It simply goes unnoticed. And that resonated and stuck in my mind. Now we get to another piece of very interesting policy. Over here you have the DST saying research is for development, for health, for agriculture, for upliftment, for economic growth, etc. And it's up to the Department of Education to decide on research publication policy for universities. So what does the DOE do? It puts in place a policy which says that they will reward the publication of articles in indexed journals. And I'll come in a moment to what those indexed journals are. And the index journals are the ISI index and the IBSS index and a list of South African journals which, according to the Academy of Science Research, are highly problematic and probably an apartheid hangover. The criteria for recognizing journals as good quality is that they have peer review and that they appear on time. Seems to me as a publisher a fairly strange criterion. There's no questioning whatever that journal articles are the output. And so in institutional university policy, because the Department of Education pays large sums of money to the universities for this kind of publication, the drive in universities is that every scholar every year must publish 2 articles in an accredited journal, or that academic will not get promotion, or might actually be actively demoted, or have his or her salary reduced. So there's a relentless drive in this DOE policy, publishing and perishing, and growing the output of journal articles. Nobody asks why journal articles. Because if I was to step back and look at the DST's policy and say to myself as a publisher, what would I publish out of my research in order to achieve those policy goals of economic growth, etc., 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 it certainly wouldn't be journal articles. That would be the last thing. They're too slow, they're too late, we're exporting our knowledge. The ethos behind this publishing and perishing policy is not collaborative but individual. You're rewarding individual achievement, and the reward is for personal promotion, not for any kind of public good. So there is a decided clash there. And in this clash, we're buying into something which is being recognized internationally as fundamentally broken, as James Boyle said in Rio last year. We have a scientific publishing system that is massively dysfunctional and really, really broken. Look at it from an African perspective. The indexes that we are required to publish in, the ISI index works on the principle that there is a percentage of knowledge that, it's the 80-20%. There's a percentage of knowledge that is more broadly based and therefore carries more weight. And I can assure you that broad-based does not include developing countries. It's entirely northern focused. The IBSS, which is the Social Sciences Index in the UK, recognizes journals, it says, that include development and developing countries, and they have lots of good words in their description of how they recognize journals about development. But there's not one single editor on the selection panel from a developing country. And the last sentence in the criteria for acceptance are the journals must appeal to British librarians. So neither the ISI index nor the IBSS index are in any way sympathetic to African output, hence some of our marginalization. Next step, you look at peer review, and I know I'm not allowed to say anything about peer review because peer review is sacred. But I have been a university press publisher, and I know a lot about peer review. And I tend to believe Paul Zaleza, who did a study of peer reviewing of African studies journals and found that they were predominantly peer reviewed by white males in Britain and America. One has to be a little skeptical of these systems and ask from our perspective if they really work. The scholarly publishing system has come under major criticism because of the dominance of big commercial publishers, excessive increases in price, pressure on libraries, and a downward spiral in which these increases of prices are driving libraries across the world to focus their subscriptions more and more on the big commercial journals and cut out everything else because they can't afford it. You've got a very strange market. It doesn't follow the laws of supply and demand, because the articles are written by academics, they're peer-reviewed by academics, so the universities pay for the writing and they pay for the peer reviewing. They're then given to commercial journals for the large part, but some non-commercial journals. Generally, copyright is handed over in the process. Those articles are then published in journals. The journals are sold back to libraries at a cost. And this has already been mentioned this afternoon by Jimmy. It's a very strange system. The universities participate in something that costs them at both ends. But this, again, has not been very much noticed until quite recently, when open access began to emerge as an alternative way of dealing with a strange system. I just wanted to notice well, of course, that the system is not free. An Australian study did an analysis of the cost and benefits of this kind of publishing. And they said in Australia the cost of getting an article published is about 19,000 Australian dollars, about 100,000 rand, with even higher costs elsewhere. So we're decidedly buying into a system where we export our knowledge, we publish it in journals, we publish it overseas, and we don't ask ourselves questions about whether this knowledge is having an impact as we would like it to do on our national development. So can we find answers in digital publishing? First of all, a major question is that of leapfrogging. Technologically, in terms of bandwidth, etc., we are behind the rest of the world. However, one's got to acknowledge in a country like South Africa, we're also quite high-tech, an advantage of being a second world country. But what I would stress is a paradox. Because we're not in the game, we're free. We do not have Elsevier lobbying our government, as the European Union did when they started introducing open access research, and as has happened in America. We don't have massive national investments in publishing. And we really are not hooked into a system of any kind. We've got a clean slate. This gives us extraordinary freedom and a great advantage in moving forward. We've got nothing to lose. We can go back to the 18th century and leapfrog to the 21st and declare ourselves a networked society. We can look at new technologies without any problem of harming what we have already. So, what can new technologies offer? What does digital publishing offer us? It offers instantaneous global reach. No more brick walls. Much lower cost publishing, because you cut out print, which is the expensive bit, and zero cost distribution. So there's much more potential for democratic access in this system, given bandwidth, of course, but I'll talk about that more in a moment. You can link research to supporting data. There's no longer the separation. You can look at research and mine downwards. And very important for us, there's greater immediacy. You cannot wait to publish information on the AIDS epidemic. People are dying by the day. And it's very telling, for example, that Bill Gates, of all people, through the Gates Foundation, has said that he will not, in South Africa, fund any AIDS vaccine research that is not open access. He will not fund anybody who's heading for patents, which coming from him is extraordinary, but I think very sensible. And there's flexibility in it so that you can reach multiple markets. Open access, in other words, putting your stuff free online, also has considerable advantages. One is a great increase in impact factors. Let's not necessarily talk about impact factors. Let's talk about readership. The most startling example is the Journal of Postgraduate Medicine in America, which went from a subscription run of about 400 printed copies, went open access, commercial open access. It's a commercial company runs this free journal. They now have 1 million hits a year, 150,000 hits a month from a subscription run of 400. There is evidence that this increase in impact is more intense for developing countries precisely because we're so marginalized. You know, it's the first-comer advantage. If I can give you a more local example, the Human Science Research Council, you probably know about, went on to an open access, dual stream, digital free print for sale, but print subsidized for sale, about 4 or 5 years ago. I know as a scholarly publisher, you're lucky if you publish a scholarly book in South Africa to sell 200. The truth be told, probably in the region of 50 of each or 100 of each sell for a truly scholarly book. According to Lindsay Waters of Harvard University Press, the average in America is probably 200 copies per year. The HSRC found for some of its publications it was getting 15,000 hits a month. You will never sell that many books in South Africa. The irony is, of course, they sold a lot more books by giving stuff away free. And not only did they sell a lot more books, but they also got much more international impact. They had phone calls from SOAS saying, when is this book coming out? We want it. Now, no publisher has international readers phoning to ask for books. So it's a complete reversal of the big brick wall. It's wonderful. That's not the only impact. The HSRC found that they became the first port of call for policymakers, parliamentarians, politicians. 20% of the President's answers to questions in Parliament come from the HSRC's free, open access, online publishing resource. I think there must be close on 300 books there now. Probably the only social sciences book publishing business in the world that is open access. But just very interesting results. So I think there's absolutely no question that the open access model has huge advantages in a situation like ours. So I weep not only softly but loudly when I heard yesterday at UCT that an anthropology journal had proudly sold itself to an American publisher for $4,000, given itself away in perpetuity. And the Thomasellis in Durban have sold their cultural studies journal internationally. There's a stream of journal publishers in frustration because they can't cope, heading off overseas with their stuff, when I think if we went strongly open access with support, this is the kind of results we could get. There are other benefits as well. You decrease duplication, you make speed science faster, much wider reach, and much better monitoring, assessment, and management of research. You can hear from Wikipedia the extra power you get from openness and collaboration, and that monitoring role, I think, is very important. Open access, of course, builds on the ethos of collaboration and interdisciplinary study and collegiality that the DST is pushing in its policy, much more than the idea of publishing in index journals. And it's networked rather than hierarchical. Finally, what I would recommend is that we get both our institutions and our government to look at the Salvador Declaration for open access, which deals with a number of issues. Firstly, that publicly funded research is made available through open access. Now, I learned 2 weeks ago that our Department of Science and Technology actually has a bill on access to publicly funded research in the final stages of drafting, and it will be tabled soon. And they have said that we will be able to comment on it, so we must watch for that one. The Wellcome Trust was a leader in the UK, and they said to the extent to which research is not available freely, it's an investment lost. And any research that's publicly funded ought to be available freely. The second thing, considering the cost of publication as part of the cost of research. The Academy of Science, which has done a research project for the Department of Science and Technology, has suggested that we take part of that subsidy that the Department of Education pays. They said 10% of that subsidy would pay for all the publishing that the university sector needed to do and make sure the publishing was properly set up and run. There are many ways of doing it, but I think simply my argument is that the universities and the government have to wake up to the fact that dissemination is essential and must be paid for. It's not a major cost. Rather cut out some patents. One patent would pay for a whole pile of publications. We need to strengthen local open access journals, which there are. Feminist Africa, for example, has been an open access journal, I think, for close on 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And create repositories and other initiatives, and promote the integration of developing countries' scientific information into the worldwide body of knowledge. In other words, make sure that our voices are heard and that the value that we have is added in the global environment, rather than us being the passive consumers. When it comes to this tricky policy of the Department of Education for rewarding publication, I would argue that rather than ditching it, perhaps we should do as the Australians have done and look at broadening it. Reward more kinds of publication. Both the Australians and the MLA in the United States are looking at whether one should reward, for example, publication for teaching and learning, whether one should reward publication for development. What criteria can one develop that evaluate the quality of the contribution of an academic, that is not just journal articles, particularly not just journal articles in international journals. And then the last piece of the puzzle, at the Kudisria conference in Leiden, it was suggested that we need an African citation index that lists our criteria for what we consider to be valuable scholarship. So I think there's a lot to be done. It sounds as if the government might be willing to listen to changes in policy. But I think the environment I've described here is one that is fraught with paradoxes and contradictions. And it would be good to get scholars and academics more involved in debating these issues and talking about what we should be doing for effective research dissemination, rather than having your heads down chasing those 2 journal articles, for which in any event there are not enough journals for them to be published in. So I think we can look forward to a much more powerful output from South Africa and other African countries, which would be not only to our benefit, but to the rest of the world as well. I don't think we have to make a separate one. I would think that what we have to do is make sure that our African content goes into Wikipedia. And I'm also very interested in the prospect of doing more translations in Wikipedia. There's a great opportunity, or the introduction of African language content as well. I don't know how you feel. I mean, my feeling would be one doesn't have to have a separate African Wikipedia, because search engines find things anyhow. What would your feeling be? That's up to us to make. You know, I think when you looked around at the number of people who'd actually edited Wikipedia, we can put that perspective in. Wikipedia is not closed to us. We can make it our own in many ways and add much more content and add perspectives in other content. There's nothing stopping us. We must just get off our butts and do it.
So why not chuck all your open access stuff in there? Why have a separate system for that?
I think it's a matter of horses for courses. Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, as Jimmy said. And an encyclopedia is an encyclopedia is an encyclopedia. And I think when it comes to research publication, for example, often what you need is a research report that then acts as a government policy document. And it's not quite the same animal at all. However, I am told by my colleagues in the Centre for Education Technology, when they debate whether the university should allow their students to cite Wikipedia, they say in that field of ICTs for education, Wikipedia is probably the only place you'll find anything. Because one of the other problems of scholarly publishing is when you get new areas like ICT and education, there aren't any journals, or there are very few. So Wikipedia in certain technological areas actually provides a major resource that doesn't seem to be available elsewhere. No, I don't think we can abandon print anyhow. I think in South Africa we can't abandon print. That's why the HSRC has a dual print model. Hindawi open access journal publishers in Egypt do parallel print and digital. And in some cases, that print actually pays for the digital. It's a cross-funding business. So I think for quite a long time, we're probably going to find ourselves doing print and digital in parallel, but relying on the digital for the broad access and for print in targeted areas where there are limitations for digital access. That's one aspect of it. Print on demand is another. We ought to be doing an awful lot more about print on demand. And I was very encouraged to hear in the context of a Creative Commons project that a colleague in London is working on, where they're looking at the links between the conventional publishing industry and the open access industry. Very interesting, there's a sort of pragmatic continuum developing, that actually Lightning Source is interested in looking at the developing world now, which they weren't 5 years ago. So if you've got a major digital and print-on-demand distribution business going in our market, it will do an awful lot both for conventional publishing and print-on-demand publishing. Then as for connectivity, things are moving at such a rapid pace that I don't know really where we're heading for or how long it would take. And my favorite example is Addis Ababa, which when I was there about 3 years ago, had absolutely no connectivity. It was pathetic. The university at Addis Ababa had nothing. World Bank and NEPAD money pours in. 3 years later, Duncan Martin of Tenet tells me that Ethiopia has overtaken us, South Africa. At the Frontiers of Knowledge Conference for African Vice-Chancellors, the Vice-Chancellors were lambasted and told that they had to get moving and get the money and get fibre laid because it would cost $2 per head of population, which the people there considered was, in terms of aid money, was not dramatic. So I think it's a very difficult area, and I tend to be a little bit cavalier because I work in the university sector, which is connected ahead of anything else. And I think in the university sector, we've got to assume that connectivity is there in one way or another, whether through the university itself or internet cafes. I'm very conscious of that. I agree with you totally. And I think African universities are devastated zones on the whole. After decades of structural adjustment, the capacity in those universities is really a disaster zone. And I think capacity building, I hope that's what the new money coming in from the World Bank and NEPAD is actually going to pay for, is massive capacity building. That said, of course, I say World Bank with trepidation, but it looks as if that's where a lot of money is coming from, in Uganda, for example. And South Africa is very privileged in that regard. We have our problems, but we are, in comparison, very, very well capacitated. What I do hope is that working out problems in the South African context where we do have capacity might provide productive models for African countries as capacity is built up, and might be translatable in that way. Because I think you'll agree, one goes into African universities sometimes and despairs at the misery of the circumstances that they are encountering after what has been done to them.